Okie doke. Ready to go. Excuse me. 7th of April, 2025. Dis and Dat. Welcome to Dis and Dat, the autonomouscollective.net. I've been sitting in on a workshop or a reading group on Frankfurt School critical theory, and this term's seminar is sort of on Adorno, Horkheimer, and the concept of, at least in the beginning, the first couple of sessions are about rackets. Not rackets like balls and rackets, but rather rackets as in racketeering, which is interesting for a variety of reasons, as I think you can imagine. And so this is the spring reading group on the science of society and critical theory. Now, racket theory is part of my trying to catch up with the reading, and so that's what this is. The idea, of course, is the general issue of the Frankfurt School or critical theory in that particular context is to sort of work out, why are things happening the way they are? Can we in fact identify? Uh, are we in the latter end stage of capitalism? Aside from cogitating about fascism and anti-fascism, that's all part of this sort of idea. Needless to say, they're in exile and discussing via a variety of letters, which is the nice thing about empirical work, letters to one another about some of these issues. For me, my interest in the seminar is probably on a different plane, but the basic elements are still there. That is connecting political economy, which I think if you've listened to the other things I've been reading on this, is to sort of work through political economy questions in the context of Frankfurt School critical theory, which for many people is not so much problematic as it is trying to estimate, what the larger effects are, and that they already make a kind of intellectual or academic division of labor, disciplinary division of labor that makes some of the issues more difficult. The seminar is still going on, and you feel free to, come by. They've already published, I think, a first volume of things that they've been working through, and it's all very interesting. Guided a little bit more on the philosophical side, perhaps, perhaps not. So here's the sort of beginning. The questions regarding the processes of monopolization and concentration of capital. And this is the period where the development of capitalism is really at its most interesting point, considering that they're beginning to see, state capitalism, as we talked about last week, sort of at work in a variety of ways, in both good and bad ways. And the analysis sort of needs to account for some of these issues or differences. The questions regarding the processes of monopolization and concentration of capital has been central to the orientation and strategy of the revolutionary working class movement in the 20th century. For instance, the increasing importance of financialization, the nature of imperialism and cartelization of key industries throughout the world was understood to be deeply related to capitalism's tendency for monopolization. And this, is a continuation of a discussion that includes the earlier kinds of ideas about imperialism, etc. The debates surrounding these questions served as a key orientation for socialist strategy. Adorno and Horkheimer's writing on class asked the question of the processes of monopolization and its consequences with the changing nature of the working class movements and its mutual interaction. For the concept of class to be concrete, it was to be understood in its political and social activity alongside other groups in totality. Hence, the nature of class and the working class movement was fundamentally interlocked. we'll be looking at Horkheimer's On the Sociology of Class Relations as an intervention into the debates of what has to be done with monopolies occupying the central role in capitalist organization and the spread of fascism throughout Europe. And of course, you can extrapolate from that the current, even if you don't want to call it fascism, authoritarianism in the current century. So, how do we understand class and class struggle with monopolies occupying the primary role in organizing social reproduction? The stage of monopoly capitalism and imperialism sheds light on the nature of group formation and integration in societies based on the extraction or or exploitation of surplus labor of producers for the social reproduction of everyday life. In the outline for a planned book on rackets, Horkheimer writes, "Now, the fact that history is a history of class struggles means that history is a history of rackets fighting amongst themselves and against the rest of society. The concept of rackets in history reveals the logic of domination immanent in class society that shackles the individual within groups, that in times of crisis results in a rapid unleashing of irrational destruction and violence. Under the limits imposed by class society, individuals are forced to integrate themselves into groups that will rule over groups below them. The oppressed become the oppressors of those further down the hierarchy." And you can see how this can be applied to a variety of actions or activities. Traditional forms of domination and rule that were understood as inadequate liberalism were instead integrated into the economic apparatus by abolishing the classes. In this way, class rule comes into its own. So this is part of the instrumental, rationality stuff. Only through the establishment of a rationally organized society that coincides with that of the association of free human beings by a conscious working class struggle will lead to the unfolding of genuine democracy and freedom. So you can see in the 1930s and 40s, obviously because of rising fascism, Nazism in Europe, and fleeing to safer climes, including the United States, and some of the readings include up until the 40s. And there are formative authors, of course, here, and a variety of points of view that I was yammering about last week about Friedrich Pollock on state capitalism, etc. And so you can see that we're only into a couple of weeks on this, and that imperialism is one of the areas often touched on by Horkheimer and Adorno without detailed elaboration, and one which lies inherently close to their general problematic through its connection to the question of monopolies and their role in the changes that took place within a broad swath of capitalist social formations and the international system as a whole over the course of the 20th century. So it is, whatever it was last week before last, the connecting the racket theory developed by Horkheimer and Adorno in the 40s to contemporary debates around imperialism, the critique of political economy, and the periodization of capitalism, that modes of production, and the idea that you could have early, middle, and late, or early, high, and late capitalism, something which is certainly, sort of problematized in the late 20th century and continuing on until the 21st. So reading Sociology of Class Relations essay along from selections by a particular book, which I read part of which I read last week, which, has some other issues with it. The whole question of quoting free, in the 21st century, talking about free competition can be a kind of a problematic issue, perhaps just lost in translation. So Milos and Sotiropoulos says, Rethinking Imperialism, a Study of Capitalist Rule of 2009. These two works have opposing orientations to the question of monopoly and its a role in the above-mentioned transformations, with Milos and Sotiropoulos taking a more macroeconomic approach that emphasizes the embeddedness of monopolies within the laws or structural determinations of the capitalist mode of production, and Horkheimer taking a more microeconomic approach that centers on monopolies themselves as the determinant instances in broader social changes that seem to entail the at least partial suspension or transformation of those laws. So ultimately, there's a kind of moral position about whether, you were looking for example, revolutionary subjectivity, as it were, and making a problematic dichotomy. Although it's not ultimately it's not a problematic dichotomy. Steve Keen talks about that we must accept the nature of the questions as always macro questions, but I think it not simply because there are philosophical movements that concern themselves with certain subjective or the issue of the subject, of subjectivity, in or against a some kind of ideological state apparatus. So you have that tension between those points of view. And that continues to this day, and we're benefited in some ways by the fact that members of the Frankfurt School managed to survive the war, and certainly they had a big effect on politics in the United States, and ultimately in the kind of formative periods of the so-called New Left, right? Marcuse being Angela Davis's advisor, and those kinds of things. My hope is that by reading them together, we'll be able to evaluate each in the context of the other, as well as see the ways in which their disagreements are relevant to our understanding of the broader discourse on imperialism within which Milios and Sotiropoulos' work is situated. So we've read the Rethinking Imperial, some of it. And today we're going to look a little bit at on the sociology of class relations. That was a lot of yammering for a couple of minutes, but Max Horkheimer, 1942 to 43, a formative document and translated by James Crane. I assume this has other scholarly interests. According to the Critique of Political Economy, social power has been based upon the monopolization of the means of production. Legal ownership has the ideological expression of the fact that a minority of people occupied a position which enabled them to exclude the rest of society from freely using the land or other instruments necessary for the continuation of social life on a given scale. The ruling class has absorbed the gifts of culture. That is to say, the difference between the total product of consumer goods and the bare necessities of life of those who produce them, and though guided itself by controlled social forces, has determined the kinds of goods to be made and the methods to be used. The privileges thus held by the ruling minorities throughout the ages were not altogether irrational. It is true that in the last analysis they were conquered and maintained by force, but the fact that the groups which enjoyed them were able to make use of that force for the organization and stabilization of some robust form of society was a sign of their being economically more advanced. Their rules promoted and conserved a mode of production which, at its heyday, was not inadequate to the developmental status of the productive forces. In this respect, the rulers represented a higher rationality than the rest of the population. In the later periods of their reigns, when the principles of organization which they represented were made obsolete by the progress of other parts of the population, their power became more convulsive and terroristic, but at the same time became weaker and hence more irrational, finally approaching blind despotism. They were transformed into purely repressive factors. The social and cultural forms for which they stood, wearily maintained by their administrative apparatus against new possibilities of human association, exercised a mutilating effect upon the minds and faculties of mankind. The notion of class, as it underlies the materialistic theory of history, needs further elucidation. It does not refer to a consistent and homogeneous unity. At least during the most typical periods, property of the means of production was not identical with their well-planned social use, nor with the existence of a unified will and determination. The various ruling groups understood each other fairly well whenever it was necessary to crush the resistance of the exploited masses or of any forces threatening to set up a new social rule. Thus, when it came to punitive measures against the progressive burghers of southern France, or even against the proletarian elements in Flanders, the worldly and spiritual powers of the Middle Ages, emperors, kings, and popes forgot their traditional conflicts for the time being and united for the defense of the prevailing hierarchical system of society. However, medieval history offers no picture of solidarity among the rulers of the Christian world. On the contrary, there was a never-ending fight over booty going on among the different hierarchical groups. Each wanted to assume authority over large areas in order to be nourished and housed and served by as large a population as possible. The same holds good for the ruling groups of Greek antiquity as represented by the city-states and factions. The ruling class, held together by the common interest in its specific mode of exploitation, has been always characterized by its internal struggles, by the efforts of one of its parts to secure the spoils that others might appropriate. The struggle for security among the elite has been a race for the most far-reaching command possible, in other words, for control of production. For several reasons, this nature of class was obscured during the 19th century. The emancipation of the bourgeoisie from the restrictions of mercantilism and the release of the laborer from serfdom seem to have abolished the insurmountable differences among the various sectors of humanity. Economic competition embracing all parts of the population was more peaceful, although more thorough and universal than the quarrels and discords of the great in times past. It was one of the achievements of Marx's writings that he, while stressing the progressive features of capitalism, unveiled its oppressive character and showed the old issue of power behind the apparently rational setup of the market system. Today, the similarity of the different historical phases of the bourgeois economy with regard to the principle of exploitation tends to become manifest. Even academic economists are shifting from the optimistic concept of an economy gravitating towards sheer harmony to a pessimistic power theory. Formerly, they blamed Marx for the introduction of the non-economic concept of exploitation. Now they go much too far in the vindication of non-economic factors. They tend to replace economy by a more than simple political or psychological explanation of present-day events. In fact, the idea of competition, as it was conceived in liberalistic theory, was misleading in many respects, two of them being particularly important for the theory of class relations. First, the nature of competition among workers was essentially different from the nature of competition among capitalists. Competition among workers, at least during the heyday of liberalism, simply meant that there were so many workers that wages could hardly rise above the cost of bare living, and in many cases even drop below it. This comes to the fore in the nature of the labor contract. Fascism has only revealed what was already inherent in liberalism, the delusive nature of the labor contract as a deal between partners equally free. Now, it would be a grave theoretical mistake to denounce the contract in modern totalitarianism as a mere formality and stress its genuine authenticity under liberalism. In both phases of the economic system, the aim of the contract may well be considered as the maintenance of that same basic inequality which is shrouded in its democratic language. Second, the monopolization of certain key positions within capitalist competition is much older than the monopolistic economy. Competition among the entrepreneurs themselves was never quite as free as it seemed. Here we're not thinking of state interference with industry, which economists are wont to reproach as long as big business does not take the state under its own management. We have in mind, rather, the inequality resulting from the different degrees of social power exercised by various industries. Such differences depend largely upon the stage of economic concentration and centralization of the respective industries, upon its importance for the regular functioning of the economic life of the nation, and upon its affiliation with the military and administrative power apparatus. Therefore, the groups which by birth or deceit, brutality or shrewdness, expertness in engineering machinery or human relations by marriage or adulation have come into control of a part of the total capital invested in industry, form a hierarchy of economic power which has limited the free play of competition at each of its stages. The discovery that the national economy of various capitalistic countries depended upon 200, 60, or even a smaller number of families brought this situation into a clear light, which eventually made the veil of free competition transparent. The development of capitalistic society, according to its own inherent tendencies, caused the progressive traits of competition to disappear. It severed the link between the needs of consumers and the profit interest of the individual entrepreneur. It diminished the possibility, slight as it was, of an independent mind gaining access to an independent position. It reduced the number of relatively autonomous economic subjects who, by the very fact of that plurality, had an interest in the functioning of general law and its impartial administration. All this vanishes in the later stages of capitalism and allows society to revert to more direct forms of domination, which in fact never had been quite suspended. See El Salvador. Yet this process is not only a reactionary one. While the inequalities among the entrepreneurs are shifting into monopolistic and eventually totalitarian control of national life, the relation between capital and labor undergoes a most characteristic change. During the latest phase of capitalism, the working classes entered competition by adapting itself to the monopolistic structure of society. It's assumed a form which fits into the monopolistic setup. Consequently, its relationships to the different capitalistic groups are no longer radically different from those prevailing among the capitalistic groups themselves. The new situation is expressed in the concept of labor with a capital L, as it is recognized as a guiding intellectual principle, not only in the minds of workers, but also with the general public. Like agriculture or industry, or even sections of industry such as steel, rubber, and oil, labor is a collective term which is not an ordinary abstractum or generale. With regard to the individual elements included in their logical structure, such entities resemble a unit like state, nation, church, rather than a generality like color or animal. They emphasize the concreteness of themselves as universal concepts and disregard the elements of which they are comprised. Their logical structure mirrors exactly their objects. It stresses the collective individualities at the expense of the single individuals absorbed by them. The logical elements of the collective concept of labor, i.e., the mass of ordinary members, are not the forces which, by their own ideas and spontaneity, determine the course of the whole. To use mathematical terminology, they are not so much the constant value with regard to the whole as the fluctuating one. On the contrary, the whole, i.e., the organization, determines and even overawes the individual. For the leaders, with their specific materialistic and power interests, with their philosophy and character structure, have an infinitely greater weight than any plain member. There is a decisive difference between the social units of our monopolistic society and those of earlier periods. All these older units are totalities in the sense that they are thoroughly organized, integrated, and ruled by a hierarchy. In contrast to modern totalities, however, the life of the totemistic tribe, the clan, the church of the Middle Ages, the nation, in the era of the bourgeois revolutions, took their course according to mythological patterns which had assumed their shape in long historical developments. The patterns had become fixed images and models for the totalities, as did the gospel for the church. True, such patterns, magical, religious, or philosophical, were intellectual authorities of the then present forms of domination. They reflected, as it were, the hierarchical stratification of society, but while they formed a cultural binding substance which maintained a social formation even when its role in production had become obsolete, they also preserved the idea of human solidarity. This they did by the very fact that they objectified spiritual structures. Any system of ideas, as far as it's written in meaningful language, whether religious, artistic, or logical, has a general connotation and pretends to be true in a universal sense. To be sure, the objectivity and universality of the older collective units formed an ideology which constituted an essential condition of their parasitic existence in the body of society. But the pattern of organization, such as the medieval church, did not directly coincide with the forms of material life. Organization in the strictest sense applied mainly to the hierarchy itself and to the ritual functions of both clergy and laity. Apart from that, neither life itself nor the intellectual framework by which it was reflected was completely integrated. The basic spiritual categories were not entirely fused with pragmatic considerations. Thus, they maintained a certain element of independence and autonomy. They were not ready-made factory products, no plastic molds simply superimposed by the organization. The participation of the layman in the activities of such bodies remained separate from his daily work and life. There was still a cleavage between culture and production. This cleavage left more loopholes than the modern type of superorganization, which virtually reduces the individual to a mere center of reaction. Modern universals, such as labor, are integral means of a unified social and economic system controlled by monopolies. By the very means of such universals, monopolies absorb the individual entirely and transform him into an element of the mechanism of production in which the so-called culture is only a cog. In short, the older forms of totalities which professed to comply with an aloof spiritual model contained an element which is lacking in the purely pragmatistic totalities of monopolism. The latter also show a hierarchical structure and are strictly integrated and despotic totalities, but the ascent of their functionaries to the upper grade has nothing to do with any quality of theirs with regard to an objective spiritual content, but almost exclusively with their ability to impose on people, to handle people, to be clever with people. Purely administrative and technical qualities define the human forces governing modern totalities. Such traits were by no means lacking in leaders of the different sectors of ancient classes, but by their radical separation from any autonomous idea. These traits give the modern totality its particular character. The concept of labor as a pragmatic totality becomes quite clear when compared with the proletariat as conceived by Marx. For him, the workers were the masses of all exploited people in industrial society. In spite of all the minor differences of their individual fates, each of them on the whole had the same outlook on life. That is, periods of employment would become shorter, the pressure of the reserve army on wages grows stronger, and misery in the midst of an ever wealthier society become unbearable. Marxian theory predicted that the capitalists would become less and less able to grant even a bare existence to the majority of the population. This trend would be expressed in the life of the average worker by a decay of his whole situation, by a deepening of his poverty, by growing hopelessness and despair. The economic pressure resulting from this state of affairs, together with the enlightenment of the workers achieved by their role in the modern productive process, would lead the formation of a party which would finally change the world. This party would spring from the similarity of the conditions of the workers all over the world. Its principles and structure would not be so much concerned with the temporary differences in their financial situation in various branches of production or various geographical and national settings. It would not express so much the actual conscience of the individual worker as affected by all the mutilating influences of exploitation. Essentially, it would embody the resistance against the frustrations imposed upon man by social forms which had become purely oppressive. It would not be based upon psychological factors, but upon the objective tendency of the economic system. The efforts of this party would be inspired by the fulfillment of just those human aspirations, material and spiritual, which were suppressed and distorted by the modern industrial process, which has made the individual a kind of accessory to machinery. The party's aims were to be connected with the plight of the individual and the masses and had no special affinity to any particular category of workers at the expense of others. It represented the oppressed masses as a whole, since the reason for the laborers' frustrations was not considered to be found in any specific defect of capitalism, but in the very principle of class rule. The efforts of the Workers' Party were to be guided at each stage by the objective idea of abolishing that rule and establishing of true community. This plan, however, was burdened from the very beginning of labor movements with an intrinsic difficulty. While the workers had to bear the full pressure of this society, whose tendency was to keep them below the minimum standard of living, they had to struggle daily in order to keep themselves alive. This meant that they kept alive a society whose rulers became stronger and stronger through the appropriated labor of the proletariat. Thus, the concept of class struggle always had these two connotations: the abolition of the wage system as such, and the attainment of higher wages within that system. It was the latter down-to-earth activity which once was conceived as a necessary stepping stone to revolution, as, for instance, through the general strike. The obsolescence of that latter idea is only one symptom of the fundamental change that has occurred. The class struggle has been transformed into a system of trade between monopolistic units, into a means of class adaptation, and into wars. Formerly, the relationship between daily struggle and revolutionary aim determined the whole labor movement, at least in continental Europe. Critical theory decided which way was to be taken in each situation. However, the struggling class was never integrated into one more competitor in the hunt for surplus value. The party was decidedly not concerned with the increase of its members' incomes, nor the income or career or social position of its leaders. Working for and even adhering to that party meant the renunciation of all such things. Party members were an avant-garde of the working class for the very reason that such principles could be understood and assimilated only by relatively advanced elements of the working class. They were supposed to control the leaders very closely, and the criterion of that control was supposed to be not the avant-garde's own wishes and needs, but the common interest of the working class in all countries, as the avant-garde was able to understand it. The tremendous majority of the proletariat was composed of individuals who, in their own psychology, expressed the mutilating effect of exploitation rather than the idea of a free humanity. The party, in spite of, even because of, its antagonism to the majority of the masses, represented thought of itself as the genuine conscience of that same majority. Because the masses were unable to concretize their true interests, the party, in its decisions, had to rely on the theory of capitalistic society. Social theory was the heir to the older systems of thought, which were supposed to have set the rules for past totalities. These older systems had vanished because the prevailing forms of solidarity proclaimed by them had proven to be treacherous. Unlike the medieval doctrine of the church or the liberalistic apology of the market system, proletarian theory of capitalism did not glorify its subject. It looked upon capitalism as the final form of domination. In no way did it justify the established ideas and superstitions of those whom it guided. In contrast to the tendencies of today's mass culture, it did not sell the people on their own way of living, which they consciously abhorred but overtly acclaimed. Proletarian theory was the critical analysis of reality, including the workers' own warped thoughts. The locus of theory was the difference between the objective interest of the exploited class and the immediate interest of the individual workers. The more this difference is obscured by the existing social setup, the more theory tends to vanish. Even when the actual masses were hostile to the party, they felt its theory linked them with their own ultimate interests. The party was not above the masses, as the labor leaders of today are above the laborers whom they integrate into their organizational patterns. The proletariat itself remains somewhat amorphous and chaotic, composed of individual subjects. Although deprived as they were of the human qualities by being transformed into mere elements of production, they had not yet become statistical figures of organizations. The character of the individual is not quite replaced by that of the member, defined exclusively by its standardized interest. Around the middle of the 19th century, the non-integrated nature of the individual worker as part of an amorphous proletariat of the disinherited peasant or artisan and his retrogressiveness in terms of the ever-increasing rational socialization of society was inseparably bound up with his progressiveness in the sense of revolution. It is significant that even today, workers' organizations, which are, with some justification, labeled as quote-unquote backward, both theoretically and economically, have proven to be the most spontaneous elements in critical situations, such as the Spanish Civil War. However, the clock cannot be put back, nor can the organizational development be revoked or even theoretically rejected. The hope of the proletariat today does not consist of sticking to traditional party and civil war patterns. Rather, it must recognize and fight the monopolistic setup of society, infiltrating into the proletariat's own organizations and infesting the minds of its individuals. In the 19th century concept of a future rational society, the traits which express the planning, organizing, and centralizing functions in opposition to chaotic liberalistic economy prevailed over the traits expressing the plight of the individual. The workers' parliamentary parties, which themselves were a product of liberalism and denounced liberalistic irrationality and promoted socialist economy in opposition to an anarchic capitalism. Under monopolism, the other side of rationality has become manifest by its increasing suppression. The participation of all in the shaping of social life, equal chance to develop one's own potentialities, equal security for all. Together with the rationalization of production, the idea of democracy calls for laying aside all fenced-off economic positions, for establishing a world free from monopolies. The amorphism by which the proletariat in the era of Marx and Engels differed fundamentally from any kind of totality was the reason why, despite its being split into national groups, skilled and unskilled labor, employed and unemployed, its interests could become crystallized in a body such as the party. The trade union, though its role was not to be underestimated, had to subordinate its actions to the party's strategy. The amorphism of the masses and its complement, theoretical thinking, both expressed in the party's fight against exploitation as such, form the contrast to the pragmatic totalities of today. The rise of workers from a passive role in the capitalistic process has been paid for with their complete integration. Labor in monopolistic society is itself a kind of monopoly. To be more exact, it is the monopoly of its leaders. Now, there are some decisive differences between labor and capitalistic monopolies. The most important arises from the fact that each capitalistic monopoly constitutes some kind of economic unity which tries to appropriate as much surplus value as possible. The term labor, however, comprises both the leaders who appropriate the profits and the members who create them. The same process, which both in reality and ideology has made labor an economic subject, has transformed the laborer, who is already the object of the entrepreneur, into the object of his organization as well. At the same time that ideology has become more realistic, more down to earth, its inherent contradiction to reality, its absurdity has increased. While the masses think of themselves as the creator of their own destiny, the leaders use them as a commodity. The fact that labor is a monopoly does not mean that its members, labor aristocracy accepted, are monopolists. It does not mean that the leaders control labor supplies as the presidents of the big corporations control raw materials, machines, or other elements of production. Labor leaders trade on this kind of merchandise, manipulate it, advertise it, and try to fix its price as high as possible. Labor, becoming a trade among others, completes the process of the reification of the human mind. A man's productive power today is not only bought by the factory and subordinated to the requirements of technology, but rationed and managed by superior agencies of the labor movement. It is a double-barreled transformation into things, with religious and moral ideologies fading and proletarian theory being abolished by the march of economic and political events. The conscience of the workers tends to be identical with the categories of their leaders' trade. The idea of intrinsic antagonism between the international proletariat and any system of domination is completely superseded by the concepts connected with the disputes of power between the various monopolies. True, the proletarians of older days did not have any conceptual knowledge of the social mechanisms unveiled by theory, and their minds and souls bore the hallmarks of oppression. Yet their misery was still the misery of single human beings, and therefore connected with them with any exploited mass in any country and in any sector of society. Their undeveloped minds were not kept in movement by the techniques of modern mass culture, hammering the behavior patterns prevalent under monopolism into their eyes and ears and muscles during leisure time, as well as during working hours, from which the so-called amusement period can hardly be differentiated in any way. Workers today, as well as the public in general, are intellectually better trained, better informed, and much less naive. They know the details of national affairs and the tricks and crooked means typical of political movements, particularly of those which live from propaganda against corruption. The workers, at least those who have not gone through the hell of fascism, will join in any persecution of a capitalist or politician who has been singled out because he violated the rules, but they do not question the rules themselves. They have learned to take the basic injustice of class society as a powerful fact and to take powerful facts as the only thing to be respected. Their minds are closed to dreams of a basically different world and to concepts which instead are being mere classifications of facts are formed under the aspect of real fulfillment of those dreams. Their childish belief in such things has been so drastically wiped out of their memory that now they stubbornly believe in reality as it is. Desperately, they repeat the commands which are knocked out into the children's systems when they try to open their eyes. There's only one way to live, and that is the actual one, the one of hard-boiled smartness. The things that seem to be opposed to it are idle slogans, lies, metaphysics. He who is unable to adapt himself to this state of affairs, whether oneself or any other man, the badly adjusted, stupid one, is rightly doomed. Modern economic conditions make for a positivistic attitude in members as well as leaders in that they resemble each other more and more. Such a transformation, though constantly challenged by tendencies in the opposite direction, strengthens labor as a new force in social life. Not that inequality is decreased. Even statistics cannot hide the fact that the gap between the social power of a single worker and that of a single corporation president is widened, and the difference is the real yardstick as far as social justice is concerned. And while the unions, dealing in certain categories of labor, have been able to raise their prices, the whole weight of society is felt by other categories, organized or unorganized. There is furthermore the cleavage between members of unions and those who cannot afford to enter in them, between the members of privileged nations and those who, in this smaller growing world, are exploited not only by their own traditional elites, but also through the medium of these elites by the ruling groups of the industrially more developed countries. The principle of exploitation has not changed at all. Marx's prediction that private competitive industry would become increasingly unable to employ the bulk of the proletariat as wage earners in the production of consumer goods or machines for consumer goods has come true. As a consequence, the association of the masses against universal exploitation has been made even more difficult by the appearance of new antagonism within the ranks of the oppressed masses themselves. The opposing interests of farmers and workers, colored and white labor, soldiers and civilians are complicated by those of the various categories of the employed, since it is the trend of capitalistic society that ever greater parts of the middle classes lose their economic independence. This process engulfs almost the whole population. It forms a complement to the emancipation of large masses from economic stagnation and pauperization. The more the world becomes ripe for the realization of theoretical thought, the more theoretical thought and every human trait which points to it seem to vanish, and, wherever they become manifest, are wiped out pitilessly by ideological control mechanisms serving the monopolies both of industry and of labor. The conscious precautions taken by radio, press, and motion pictures are only a visible supplement to the unconscious trends necessitated by economic and social development. The persecution of any individual, any independent social thought represents none of the groups struggling for a greater share of power and has no usefulness for any prevailing interest, is not only planned and practiced by the agencies of culture, but takes place within each member of society. There are, however, some centers of resistance left within man. It is a counter-evidence against social pessimism that notwithstanding the continuous assault by collective patterns, humanity is still alive, if not in the individual as a member of social groups, at least in the individual as far as he is left alone. The power of collective patterns of monopolistic society goes far beyond the sphere of conscious influence. From the day of his birth, the individual is made to feel that there's only one way to get along in this world, by resigning his unlimited hope. This he can only achieve by imitation or mimesis. He consciously ruminates what he perceives around him. Not only consciously, he acquires judgment and notions much later, but with his whole being. Long before he can even speak, he echoes the gestures of the persons and things around him. Later on, he echoes the traits and attitudes of all the collectives at whose mercy he is: his family, his classmates, his athletic team, and all the other teams which enforce a deeper conformity, a more radical surrender by complete assimilation than any father or teacher in the 19th century. By echoing, repeating, imitating the surroundings, by adapting himself to all the powerful groups to which he belongs, by transforming himself from a human being into a member of specific organized bodies, by reducing his potentialities to readiness and ability to conform to and gain influence in such bodies, he can finally manage to survive. It is survival by practicing the oldest biological means of survival, mimicry, as in mimesis. Modern culture is a resurrection of oppressed mimetic practices. Just as the child repeats the word of his mother, and the youngster the brutality of his elders, at whose hands he has suffered much, industrialized culture, the giant loudspeaker voice of monopolism, copies reality endlessly and boringly. All the ingenious devices of the amusement industry serve but to reproduce over and over again, without betraying the slightest revolt, scenes of life which are already dull and automatized when they happen in reality. Motion pictures, radio, popular biographies, and novels shout incessantly the same rhythm. This is our groove. This is the rut of the great and the little ones. This is reality as it is and should be and will be. Even the words which could express a hope for something else than the fruits of success have been absorbed. On the one hand, beatitude and everything which refers to the absolute has been assimilated by confining the idea to religious edification as a leisure time function. It has become part of Sunday school vernacular. Happiness, on the other hand, has come to mean exactly the normal life of which thought, even religious thought, at certain times contained a radical criticism. Language has been so thoroughly reduced to the function ascribed to it in positivistic theory, it has become just another tool in the giant apparatus of production of monopolistic society. Every sentence which is not equivalent to an operation in that apparatus appears to the layman just as meaningless as it is decried to be by contemporary semantics, whose doctrine actually implies that only the purely symbolic and the operational, that is, the purely senseless sentence makes sense. Under the pressure of the pragmatic totalities of today, man's self-expression has become identical with his function in the prevailing system. Within himself, as well as others, man desperately represses any other impulse. Wherever he perceives an unadjusted longing, he feels an overwhelming wrath and fury, an utter rage which crashes down on everybody and everything, which, by exhibiting the idea of complete fulfillment, forces him to curb and repress the longing anew. It is just this spitefulness that indicates that humanity has not been completely absorbed by the repressive collectivization of man. It has a disquieting aspect for the rulers. In spite of their social and psychological victories, they sense that their hold over the masses is in jeopardy. This is why terror has to implement collectivization. In the earlier periods of bourgeois society, as well as in the history of other forms of society, there existed a greater multitude of independent economic subjects who took care of their own individual property and maintained it against competitive social forces. Such times necessitated the fostering of relatively independent thought, which by its very nature, its objectivity, is related to the interests of humanity. Against its own wishes, the society of middle-class proprietors, and particularly the professions related to the now vanishing economic sphere of distribution, had to promote thinking which, whether they liked it or not, was antagonistic to class rule and domination. Today, The individual in the course of his economic functions is never directly confronted with society. It is always his group, his association, his union, which takes care of his rights. Therefore, the very category of the individual, with its good and bad implications, is in a state of liquidation. Thought, unrelated to the interest of any established group, unrelated to the business of any industry, has lost its significance. It is considered vain and empty. That self-same society, which in the fact of hunger and starvation in great areas of the world leaves a considerable part of its machinery idle, that society which suppresses or shelves important inventions and which, in the rare periods of full employment, devotes a tremendous part of its working hours to idiotic advertisements. For even what is left of culture boils itself down to advertisements and propaganda, or to the production of instruments of destruction. That self-same society to which these sinister luxuries are inherent has made usefulness its gospel. Conversely, it has stamped the only ultimate aim for which civilization could be useful, a luxury, truth, as it envisages the realization of humanity instead of the domination of nature. However, the difference of the actual situation from other chapters of history should not be exaggerated. In the earlier periods mentioned above, the existence of independent thought in the Middle Ages was paid for by the miserable material condition of the working class, even in the most highly developed countries. The revolutionary thinkers of the proletariat came from the upper or middle classes. Since that time, the working class as a whole has made tremendous progress. Its rationality, as far as it is able to express itself, is purely pragmatic and therefore particularistic, like that of the rest of society. But the tremendous physical, organizational, and cultural pressure which is necessary to keep it in this state, the increasing furor with which not only every trace of independent political practice, but the expression of any of any independent thought, or even the mere suspicion of the existence of such thought, are hated and eventually persecuted. The hectic strengthening of all reactionary organizations and movements betray the rising fear of abolition of fear and repression. The feverish attempt to channel the ever greater fury which develops in the masses due to the necessity of repressing their own original longings, and to prevent that fear from being conquered by eventual insight into the ever-increasing senselessness of that repression and to the real identity of human interests. Such channeling, which has always been the business of the rulers of their cultural and terroristic apparatus, has also become the business of labor organizations, which at the same time lead labor into the struggle of competition and increase its strength. The antagonism between the classes is reproduced within the structure of labor, and especially within the labor unions themselves, although it is perhaps better veiled there than it has ever been in society as a whole. Docilely and without a hint of any opposing interest, the workers surrender part of their money to the mammoth trusts which trade in their labor. It is not so much the amount of the contributions which make the labor leaders a kind of group of the ruling class, but the social control exercised by them on the basis of these contributions. Certainly a large part of their material interest is opposed to the interests of other competing groups, but this holds true for all groups which have ever formed the ruling class. They have all fought each other. Their affinity springs from the source of their income. They all live on what they can grasp from the circulating surplus value. This also goes for the industrialist himself. The working hours under which his immediate supervision are spent on the production of surplus value do not correspond to the share he himself gets of the whole surplus value at the disposition of the ruling class. He receives his proof not as an industrialist, but as a businessman. As such, he has to compete with others in order to get as large an amount as possible out of the entire result of each production period. He is in the same position as those capitalists whose business is not entirely productive. Like the bankers, the entrepreneurs in the communications or entertainment industries, and all the liberal professions and activities which are exercised by these so-called third persons. All of them have to develop their skills of shrewd calculation, of not giving away everything without getting as much as possible in return, of becoming acceptable to stronger groups, of using their fellow man exclusively as a tool for strengthening their grip on society. This skill is not derived from conscious determination. People are determined to assume such an attitude towards life, but awareness of their willingness stirs up countertrends in their own minds and the minds of the people upon whom they want to impose. The qualities necessary for assent spring from the unconscious. They have become second nature in man. Be that as it may, these psychological qualities are indispensable. The liberalistic ideology that a man's fate depends on the economic significance of his activity demands two corrections. First, economic significance in the society means usefulness not with regard to the needs of all, but with regard to the essential conditions of the hierarchy of power. In order to be allowed to live, the individual must prove his value to some of the groups which are engaged in their struggle for a larger share of control over national and international economy. Second, the quantity and quality of goods or services which an individual contributes to the wealth of society is but one of the factors which determine his success. The more the economy is rationalized, the more obvious it becomes that the differences of intelligence needed for the various functions could easily be overcome by adequate training. Under such conditions, adaptability to the prevailing power relations rather than any other personal trait becomes paramount. It has been the fallacy of technocratic thinking from Saint-Simon to Veblen to underestimate the similarity of promising character traits in the different branches of production and of business and to confound rational use of the means of production with rational inclinations of certain categories of its agents. The engineer indeed embodies progress. He looks at people not exclusively as means of profit making. His function as commander is more directly linked to the requirements of the work itself. Therefore, his orders bear on the signs of greater objectivity. His subordinates recognize at least part of his commands is founded in the nature of things and therefore rational in a universal sense. But even the essence of this rationality is not reason, but domination. The engineer's understanding of things regards none of their elements by which they can be handled and transformed, their weakest points, so to speak. He is not interested in things as they really are, but as they can be fitted into schema completely alien to their own nature. In fact, his methods of thinking, his categories, lead necessarily to the triumph of modern technology, the smashing of atoms. No one is considered as an aim, all are mere tools. His mind is that of class society in its streamlined form, without any ornaments. His purposeful rule would make humanity a mass of utopia without any purpose. The labor leaders have become an acquisitive group among others. The conditions under which they work are more difficult. It's not so easy for them as leaders of the big capitalist trust to keep their doings from discussion by public opinion, which in the last analysis is controlled by the entrepreneurs. The large masses of members with whom the labor magnates have to deal, plus certain basically democratic patterns inherent in all non-fascist labor organizations, do not allow for the same conspiratory techniques which have been employed so successfully by big business in all its national and international undertakings. This is why the labor bureaucracy tries to dispense with membership meetings as much as possible. Every ruling minority needs secrecy as a condition of its perpetuation. Despite all these essential differences, however, the similarity between the organized totality of labor and other monopolies should not be underrated. Each of the capitalist, professional, and labor groups exercise specific functions in the social process, and each uses that function to get as large a share of power over men, roots, and services as possible. There have been, throughout history, diverse methods employed in this struggle: competition, swindles, robbery, war. This struggle, which, as pointed out in the beginning, characterizes the setup of each ruling class as definitely in its role in production, has become a trait of the labor groups today. Although labor leaders cannot achieve any results without obtaining, at least temporarily, some advantages for the workers, but their own social and economic power, their own position and income, all these factors overwhelmingly superior to the power, position, and income of the individual worker, depend on the maintenance of capitalism. This economic fact holds true despite the great services they may render to their respective memberships. The entrepreneurs' activities too often had a positive effect on the income of labor. Higher incomes of the entrepreneurs are no more opposed to the interests of labor than higher incomes of the labor leaders. But there is now a new kind of solidarity between the old and the new elites. Social history during the last decades has brought closer cooperation between them. The attitude of the great labor unions towards the state in the last several decades was similar to that of the big capitalist organizations. They were concerned with preventing the government from mingling in their affairs. No interference with or without our private business was their doctrine. It was the Herr Haus standpoint. In the beginning, the increasing economic power of monopolies has made understanding of the central government imperative for labor leaders, and the same understanding is important for the government. The integration of cooperative elements into the administration has made progress during the war. Society becomes a planned and regulated process. Not with regard to great events, they still depend on blind forces resulting from the struggle between the classes and among the various ruling groups. But as far as the life of the individual is concerned, not in the sense of self-administration, the decisions are made as compromises among the prominent whose interests do not correspond to those of the rest of the society, but with regard to a more streamlined performance of the material and human apparatus of production. It is possible that once the strongest capitalistic groups gain direct control of the state, the labor bureaucracy will be abolished, as well as the governmental one, and be replaced by more dependable commissioners of big business. Although this could be achieved without a formal change of constitutional principles, it would mean a development similar to that in Germany. It is also possible that labor in its actual structure will acquire an even stronger portion of the setup to come. In both cases, the material condition of labor may temporarily improve in the ruler states of the future at the expense of the vanquished, as well as the vassal nations, but at the same time, the gap between the significance of a single member and of the prominent functionaries will deepen. The impotence of the human individual will become more marked, and the differences in wage according to sex, age, industrial, and race groups will increase. This will bring about the triumph of particularistic rationality within the workers and their complete disillusionment. They will fit even more completely into the system and at the same time become more obstinate against its exacting requirements. Concomitant with all the labor-saving devices which the workers expertly enjoy is an ever-increasing personal discontent and an economical attitude towards any expenditure of labor power. No one wants to be a sucker. True, the technological process has not made the workers revolutionary, but refractory, insubordinate, difficult to handle. While formerly the ruling class could use sweeping ideologies which were good enough for the whole population, monopolism has had to develop quite a science of personnel management. Big plants today keep specialists who cater to the personal problems of the single worker. They adapt the smartest techniques, such as resort places, abridged psychoanalysis, and Tchaikovsky's symphonies over loudspeakers during working hours. All this accompanies an unabated terror against anyone who seriously opposes the system as such. Workers become a more and more disquieting factor within the whole setup of monopolism by their very assimilation to its material and cultural patterns. They threaten to gain what this period destroys, namely in individuality. Therefore, capitalism itself tends to promote pseudo-collectivistic social patterns and fascist forms of government. Gradual abolishment of the market as a regulator of production is a symptom of the vanishing influence of anything outside decisive groups. True, the needs which in the market system made themselves felt in a most distorted, anonymous, and irrational form can now be determined by statistics and be satisfied or rejected in accordance with the policy of the rulers. But if this new rationality is in one way closer to the idea of reason than the market system, it is in another way farther from it. Dealings between the ruling and the ruled were really determined not by the market, but by the unequal distribution of power as it was expressed in the property of the means of production. Yet the transformation of human relations into objective economic mechanisms granted the individual, at least in principle, a certain independence. Domination was humanized by dehumanized, that is to say, intermediary spheres. Today, the expression of human needs is distorted no longer by the dubious economic indicators of the market, but by their conscious molding in a giant system of socio-psychological surgery. The misery of unsuccessful competitors and of backward groups can no longer be ascribed to anonymous processes which permitted a distinction between them as economic subjects and as human beings. The downfall of vanquished opponents, competitors, as well as whole social strata, minorities, and nations is decided upon by the elites. Those who are to suffer are singled out and called by their names. However, the insidious policies of economic leaders today are as private and particularistic, and therefore even blinder with regard to the real needs of society than the automatic trends which once determined the market. It is still irrationality which shapes the fate of humans. There are more people today who have real insight into the economic situation and its potentialities than at any other period. Their chances seem to have been improved by the progress of methods of production, communication, and planning, and by the decomposition of all kinds of superstitions. Actually, the position of thought have been deteriorated by the perfection of the methods of domination, by the extinction of theoretical thought, and by the new and stronger taboos resulting from the pseudo-enlightened philosophy of pragmatism, which expresses the abandoning of unintegrated thought. Well, that's a lot of stuff there and a lot of arm waving, and there's more of it. And I hope you got a sense of it anyway. Oh, actually, we're very close to the end. Um, it is this idea of the racket in the final paragraph, a true sociology of the racket as the living element of the ruling class in history could serve both a political and a scientific purpose. It could help clarify the goal of political practice, a society whose pattern is different than that of the racket, a racketless society. It could serve to define the idea of democracy, which still leads an underground existence in the minds of individuals. Today, rackets have adapted this idea to their economic and political practice. They have slyly formalized political concepts and thus made expert political cliques, dominating whole groups and states into champions of democracy. Conversely, they brand humanist theoreticians as advocates of dictatorship, for they have tried to promote in practice, no matter how inadequately, democratic contents. Despite all this, the meaning of democracy, deeply connected with that of truth, is not forgotten. It needs to be expressed against a world which is more repressive and hostile than ever, and against the shrewdest tactics of stupidity. Scientifically, the sociology of the racket could yield a more adequate philosophy of history. Moreover, it could help throw more light upon many issues in the realm of humanities, even upon such remote and controversial problems as the initiation rites and patriarchal rackets of magicians in primitive tribes. It would show that the breaking of young men at the occasion of their entrance into such tribes represented acceptance, not as much into the community as such as into a particularistic social totality. Very similar observations can be made with regard to the relation of adults and children through the Middle Ages up to the beginnings of the 19th century. Adults, with regard to the children, behaved as a totality. The racket was also the pattern of the organization of males with regard to females. The modern concept serves to describe past social relations. The anatomy of the man is the key to the anatomy of the monkey. So there's something there. It is a much larger system of thought, and certainly it's clear that you see the formation of a variety of fields, noting, of course, that a field like sociology, for example, really comes into its own during this period as a relation to institutions of social welfare. Anthropology becomes greater because the ability to extend certain colonizing practices. Imperialism helps all of this stuff go along, and of course there are wars. So all of that is there. Now I've gotten to at least to the end, and you can read for yourself at the link. Let me see if there were no brickbats or interventions. I will stop the share. Go to stop the live stream and return us to our regular program, which at the top of the hour will be a different thing. We will hopefully have a couple of folks who want to share their writing.